Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing the continuation from lecture 5.4. Okay. So we have already discussed about the qualitative methods for public analysis, and today we'll be discussing the quantitative aspects, statistical analysis, policy analysis methods like BC analysis, sensitivity analysis, cost effectiveness analysis we'll be discussing, right? So coming to the statistical analysis, as we understand that statistics is all about describing the data, and this description of data is necessary to make statements about the population from a given sample data, right? And this, so that means here we are emphasizing on sampling data from the entire population. Again, for statistical analysis, we are adhering to two types of analysis. The first one is descriptive statistics and the second one is inferential statistics. So let's discuss about the first one, that is descriptive statistics. So what are these descriptive statistics? So these statistics provide different ways to assemble, tabulate and summarize data so that their meaning can be more easily understood for policy making. So for example, we can take the techniques for grouping the data, we can get the help of different tools and technique for grouping the data and also describing their characteristics, identifying different relationships among the existing variables that we are considering, and also presenting and displaying the data using different forms like graphs, tables and maps. Okay. So these are the descriptive statistics for the sample data. So likewise, we can use the inferential statistics, and generally inferential statistics are used to make generalizations, right, about the population. So that means by making the observation from the sample data, we can generalize the same for the population, right? So this inferential statistics indicate how likely it is that the relationship or associations found in the sample data can describe the characteristics in the entire population from which the sample was taken, right? So if it is so, it simply in technical language we can say inferential statistics helps to understand whether the findings are significant. Okay. So likewise, we can take into account different other statistical forms of analysis like your visual statistics, okay, visual statistical analysis. And in this context, we can analyze the 5 typology of comparisons that Altman has already used. So he has used components, right? Comparison for components, for number of different items or differences, frequency distributions, right? Correlations between variables and also the time series analysis. So all these are summarized in this table, how the comparisons can be taken for components, for item wise, for frequency distribution, for correlation, right, and also for time series analysis by different visual statistics, by using different visual statistics, okay, statistical analysis. So for component, we can take into account the graphical forms like pie chart. For item wise comparison, we can take into account the bar graph, right? And for frequency distribution, we can use the graphical forms of histogram or dot diagram, and here we can take into account the typical comparisons that, and these are very easy, but yes, these are very strong measure for visualizing the relationship comparison or for making a policy also, right? So we have also discussed about different other forms of comparison like correlation and time series, right? For correlation shape, we used to, as Altman has already advocated for, that scatter diagram would be appropriate, and for time series, we are using time series plotting curves, right? So to see to strains, or we can see that how the variations are occurring from a particular time to another time, right? So and these are some of the typical comparisons that you can take into account, okay. So given this understanding, now we can move to the 6 graphic forms for comparison that we have already mentioned about, just to summarize, right. So Altman again proposes 6 graphic forms that can be very effectively used to describe different forms of comparison among policies or between policies. For example, we can take the case of pie chart. These are very useful for illustrating, for examining the proportions among different items, or bar charts for items, again histograms or dot diagrams for frequency distribution, and scatter diagrams for correlations analysis, right? Time series curves for the trend analysis. Okay, so these are different forms of graphics, okay, that we can effectively use as policy analysts to describe the policies. Okay, and for maximum effectiveness, the preparation of these graphics should be the part of both the analytical process as well as the communication process as well. Okay, and for this reason, the 4 steps for preparing the useful graphs that we need to take into account as policy analysts are the related to the hypothesis formulation, that how hypotheses are formulated or theories described or analyzed, right, using data, right. And the second could be the using different methods like scatter plots or any graphics that we mentioned just now, or we can think about the other steps could be developing the layouts like the pie charts, bar chart or histogram or even time series, okay, plotting and entering the data, right. So that could be the steps, okay, and finally completing the graphics with relevant title, scale, key and a date, source and explanatory notes. So these are typical simple cases of your graphic presentation of the data for policy analysis. Okay, so we can take the example. Let's say that there is a municipality in a metropolitan city, and that municipality is facing with the proposal to increase the availability of rental houses, right, or to subsidize the cost of rental housing. Okay, and as an analyst, you are asked to present an policy analysis of this problem of housing to, let's say, the municipal council or city council. Okay, and before presentation you also access the data on gross annual household income and annual housing cost, and wanted to examine the affordability of rental housing in that metropolitan city. Okay, so here what can you do? You can use the descriptive statistics, right, simple by using simple descriptive statistics, okay, which are perceived to be important tools for basic data analysis, because these descriptive statistics can summarize the attributes of the data. The most common descriptive statistics that we used to use in policy analysis are mean, all the measures of central tendencies like mean, median, mode, right, even the measures of variations like the range, variance, standard deviations. Okay, and these descriptive statistics, they summarize the attributes of a data or a data set, and that is the reason they are very important tools for the basic data analysis. Okay, then the other form of the analysis would be the association or correlation analysis. So these are also part of statistical analysis. So initially maybe the policy analyst might be interested to examine the frequencies, that how often a particular thing happened. Okay, and the objective is to discover how often particular values occur in a particular set of data. So for example, for the dropouts in those schools which doesn't have sanitary facilities, so it is very likely that you can think about the real world situation where we are finding the reports, the news that the dropouts in the schools are increasing. That means the students are going out of the schools, right, and we are finding that in most of these cases where the students are dropping out, in those cases, in those schools, there is no sanitary facilities or there is very poor sanitary facilities. Okay, so what we are doing, because as a policy analyst or data analyst, what you are doing, you are just examining the frequencies in how many schools the dropouts are happening, right, in which year maybe. Okay, so in how many schools the dropouts are happening, in what number, let's say, so we are saying that this is school number 1, 2, 3, right. So how many schools and what is the dropout? Okay, so this is the frequencies, like, okay, we are examining the frequencies in order to draw some inference about the population, or for this particular issue in order to have some policy decisions, right. So, and again, sometimes apart from examining the frequencies, it is also helpful to have indication of relationship, right, between two variables or among two or more variables. So the question could be like this, that is there dropouts in those schools which have sanitary facilities for girls, or what is the relationship between school dropouts and availability of sanitary facilities? So in order to answer this, you need to understand, or you need to have the correlation coefficient analysis, or a gamma, or a q, Yule's q, right? So from these values you can find a relationship. Okay, so that is the reason correlation or associations are necessary. Okay, but moreover, sometimes we have to find out more than this correlation or association, that is a causal relationship. So sometimes the policy analysts may be interested to find more about the causal effects, the cause and effect relationship. Okay, so the other advanced methods like experimental methods or regression methods, right? So or you can say different controlled or experiment groups, right, doing experimentation, are really helpful in understanding this kind of data set for policy analysis, right? So apart from these, we can also use tables, right, tabling, making appropriate tables for interpreting the data, or to see that what are the data is telling about, for taking necessary steps about the particular data set or policy in discussion, or a problem in discussion. Apart from this, we can also take the help of mapping and spatial analysis. Nowadays there is much significance, we can say, is for the mapping and spatial analysis, and we can find different softwares that are useful and helpful in making appropriate maps and spatial analysis for policy decisions. So some of these very popular ones are the Google Maps, the Google Earth, or Google Earth Pro, Google Map Maker, GIS, QGIS. So the number is really very is increasing. The number of this type of softwares and the spatial data sets are also increasing simultaneously to have meaningful interpretation of statistical analysis. And apart from this, the statistical analysis and spatial analysis, the other statistical measures, those which are really helpful in understanding the policy and analyzing the policies, are measures of significance. So what is this measures of significance? So as I told you that there could be the statistical analysis in form of descriptive statistics and inferential statistics as well. So the second part, the inferential statistics, allows the policy analyst to make probabilistic statements about a population from the sample analysis. Okay, so from this sample data set itself, the analyst will be making probabilistic decisions for the population. Okay, so they allow us, like the policy analyst, to say how sure we are that the results obtained from the sample will resemble the results we would have gotten had we questioned the whole population. Okay, so that is what it is known as the measures of significance. Okay, so for example, the results are statistically significant at, let's say, 0.05 level, that means 5% level of significance. Okay, so that means 95% confidence. Okay, so 0.05 level of significance means the results did not occur by chance. Okay, so and this happened because of only just 5% case. Okay, so that means 95% case the results happened. Okay, so in policy analysis, both these kinds of findings, like the mere association as well as the causality, can be taken as of great value for policy analysis as well. Okay, and for as I told you that for developing the causal explanation, we can take into account some of the requirements, like we need to have a solid database for this causal explanation, right? Otherwise it would be better to have association or correlation analysis. Okay, so the first one is a solid data set that we need for causal explanation, and the second could be a solid theory that is needed with the findings for statistical association, and also the successful attempts for ruling out the rival hypothesis, like your self-selection data in the sample. Okay, so given this understanding on how the statistical analysis can be helpful in policy analysis, right, and it can helpful in policy decision making. Okay, so the next part of our discussion is about different methods that we are using for policy analysis. So we are targeting to discuss three different methods of analysis like benefit cost analysis, then sensitivity analysis and cost effectiveness analysis, right? So let's start with the case of benefit cost analysis. Okay. So I'll be briefing about how this benefit cost analysis are being used in the context of policy making and policy analysis, and followed by it Professor Singh will be taken a detailed case study of benefit cost analysis in the next lecture, right? So let's discuss this benefit cost analysis by taking an example of DDT use. Okay, so DDT is a very strong poison, right? And the repercussion of this poison and the use of the poison and followed by the repercussion has already been reported by many scientific journals. And one write-up in terms of a very strong policy write-up, I would say, is by Rachel Carson, right? So she is a scientist and she wrote a very influential book on the use of DDT and how it has impacted the environment, right? So it has already been analyzed, right, in her book The Silent Spring. And long before in 1962 it was published, but still it has its influence right now for making many of the strong environmental policy decisions. Okay, so you know what is the use of this DDT, okay, right? For many agricultural farming, these DDT are used for insect killing. Okay, so the thing is that we need to understand, we need to take this DDT as a policy. Okay, so for a policy we need to have a question that whether the use of DDT is good or bad, because all these have already been described and there are many observation, empirical verification regarding the use of DDT has already been described. Okay, so given these repercussions, given these verifications, now the question is about the policy, that whether we need to ban this DDT or whether this use of DDT is good or bad, should be continued or should be banned, right? So there are many observations, that there are many suggestions, there are many opinions regarding the positive aspects of DDT use and negative aspects of DDT use, right? And there are also many ethical approaches and practices aligned with the DDT. So that is the reason it needs a policy. Okay, so for example, I can take the quote from Whelan's book. Okay, so that is, if I were a decision maker in Sri Lanka where benefits from DDT use outweigh the risk, I would decide differently. It is not up to us to balance risk and benefits for other people, right? This is what is been quoted, is remarked by William Ruckelshaus in 1972, the head of the USA Environmental Protection Agency and the advocating to ban DDT, right? But there are many cases that in the USA the DDT was, there is a pressure to ban DDT, but for the rest of the world there was like different repercussions, right? So there are different positive repercussions, that if DDT is not, there are negative repercussions, I would say, because if the DDT is not going to be used, then there are other repercussions like malaria occurrences have increased at that point of time. So as a result, even the same policy, right? So that is banning of DDT. This is a good thing or good policy in perhaps in the USA, but it is not a good thing or good policy for, let's say, African countries or even some of the Asian countries as well, like Sri Lanka, right? So that is the reason the head of US EPA for advocating the ban of DDT. So Mr. William opined this, that the decision to take about DDT use for the USA is something different for Sri Lanka. And as a policymaker, then the policymaker needs to take a stand that what is the benefits and what is the cost. What is the benefits and what is the risk of using the DDT in a particular situation or particular region, right? So accordingly, this can be taken into account. So that is the reason I am just highlighting that for benefit cost analysis, we have to take into account different observation, different practices, different ethical approaches as well. The same policies, when it is perceived to be a good one in one country or one context, right, is perceived to be bad for another country or another context. So this policy decision making is really very complex affair. Okay, and this good policy, public policy, it requires balancing costs and benefits, right? And that is the reason this BCA, benefit cost analysis, is of great importance. So the question is, how do we evaluate the competing proposals and priorities, right? And that is the reason we refer to the benefit cost analysis, and this is the process by which the benefits of a particular project or a policy are identified, tallied, and also compared to its cost. Okay, and if we are finding that the benefits from these projects or policy are greater than outweighing the cost for any project or policy, then the society gets better off. Okay, and of course here we have to take into account the distribution of those costs and benefits. Okay, that means who is getting benefits and who is bearing the cost. So this aspect must be taken care of. Okay, so given this understanding that what is the context of benefit cost analysis and how it can be helpful in analyzing a policy, like did it use when it is good for a particular country like the USA, but it is not good for Sri Lanka or some of the African countries, because the benefits associated with the use of DDT is outweighing the cost of DDT. Right, so that is the reason in the rest of the world where many countries are prone to malaria, particularly in those countries, the use of DDT is meaningful and benefits would be more. So the policy decision maker can take a decision based on this analysis whether to continue DDT use, even though the WHO, World Health Organizations, as well as some of the developed countries have already banned it. Okay, long before in 72. So in order to understand this, I'll be just very quickly briefing about the basic tools that we are using for BCA, right? So the first requirement for benefit cost analysis is to have common units of measurement. That means monetization is a must, right? So every benefits and every cost that is accrued from a particular policy or project must be measured in common units, like a monetary units. Okay, so maybe in terms of rupee or dollar. Okay, and followed by the these benefits and cost must be converted in form of the present discounted value, which is known as net present value. Okay, net present value is the present value of the benefits minus the present value of the cost, is known as the net present value. Okay, and it is followed by evaluating uncertainty, because many times you are finding that the public projects are prone to uncertainty. That sometimes what happens, for example, that we are considering about expansion of our national highways, right? And for that reason, let's say 50 crores of rupees would be required, right, within a span of 3 years. But once the project is going to be started, okay, so then it is found that there are some uncertainties, right? And that is the reason this cost may increase by another 5 crore. Okay, it may increase, may, so this is a probability associated with the uncertainty, that the cost may increase by another 5 crore, right? So this is how we can identify the uncertainty and how can we evaluate the uncertainty. So for that reason, we are taking into account the probabilistic estimates, that for 90% it would be, the cost would be the 50 crores, and there is a 5% probability that that there is uncertainty of another 5 crores rupees. Okay, so 90%, and this is 90%, and this is 10%, let's say, right? 10% for 5 crores. Okay, so we are finding what is the probabilistic estimate, right, for evaluating this uncertainty. Okay, so 90%, 0.9 multiplied by 50 crore plus this is 10%, so 0.1 multiplied by 5 crores. So we are getting what is known as how to evaluate the uncertainty. Okay, and we have to take into account the opportunity cost of that said policy project as well. Okay, and we have to consider the economic and non-economic values, because the many of the benefits and costs may not be in economic units, rather it would be in non-economic values, like non-monetary values. Okay, so once these tools, the basic tools of BCAs are found, right? Then the next step is to take a decision by using the benefit cost analysis, that whether the policy or the project under consideration should be taken into account or it should be rejected. Okay, this is based on the criteria is, if the net present value is greater than 0, then we have to take the decision that yes, the policy should be accepted or project should be accepted, otherwise it should be rejected. Okay, and here we have to take into account, for we have to find out that what is this net present value. As I told you, that present value of benefits minus present value of the cost. But many times the benefits can be accrued, or benefits and cost can happen in future time as well. So for that reason, these future benefits and future costs should be converted into present benefits and present costs. Okay, then we have to do this present value of benefits and present value of the cost in order to find out the net present value. Okay, so once we take the decision based on this value, that whether the net present value is greater than 0 or not, that means positive net present value is generally accepted as policy or project. So the next step is valuing inputs and outputs, that how much is something worthy, right? That something is worth, right? How can you find that something is worth? If people are willing to pay for it. Okay, otherwise it will not be considered as worthy. Okay, so this willingness to pay for it is not, but is expressed in terms of WTP, and we have to capture that if we need to consider something, some inputs or output to be valuable, then we can think about, or we can capture through the willingness to value and willingness to pay. Okay, and some of the other measures that we can also take into account in order to decide that whether the inputs or outputs is of value, or how something is worthy. So it can be captured through awarding behavior, it can be captured through the shadow pricing, like your contingent valuation, right? It can also be captured through the reveal preferences, that just assigning a value to a particular cost and benefits, okay, based on the observed behavior and observed behavior, like hedonic market analysis for housing. Okay, so all these are taken to be account for valuing inputs and outputs. Okay, so apart from these, we have to also take into account some the other aspects, right? The statistical analysis, so that is your value of statistical life. So what is this statistical life, value of statistical life? So here, in considering the benefit and cost, when we take into account human life as benefits or human life as cost, right? So when human lives are cost or benefits, then the policymakers must align the monetary value to each life, right, which is known as the value of statistical life. And this is required to conduct the benefit cost analysis of a particular policy. And for these analysis, the other tools which are required is like your contingent valuations, reveal preferences, or hidden market analysis, through which we can find this. Okay, and it would be helpful in the benefit cost analysis. So the other aspects that we need to take into account are choosing social discount rate. Okay, so this is really a very challenging questions about the social discount rate. Okay, so what is this social discounting rate? That means deciding how social costs and benefits in the present ought to be compared with the benefits or cost in the future. Okay, so that is what is known as the social, that is what is known as the rationale for choosing the social discount rate. Okay, so the questions that is required to understand this particular concept could be that how much should society be willing to invest right now, today, to avert the damages that may occur years from now, or sometimes we can think about even generations in the future, right? So for this type of questions, right, and also the questions like, at what rate should the cost of those future damages be discounted to the present, right? So for all these questions, right, we have to understand what is known as the social discount rate. Otherwise, it would not be possible for us to do a benefit cost analysis. Okay, so what is this social discount rate? The rate that is used to discount the social cost and benefits to the present. Okay, so that is known as the social discount rate, and it has profound impact, very profound impact in the benefit cost analysis. Okay, so for this social discount rate, we can go back to understand what is known as the Ramsey's formula, right? So for calculating the social discount rate, we have to calculate what is known as the social rate of time preferences. Okay, that is already used by Ramsey rate or Ramsey formula, right? And the second aspect is the social opportunity cost of capital. So these are two very important things that needs to be discussed, right, for social discount rate. And so, and again, we have to also take into account that how this social discount rate is important in benefit cost analysis. That is the reason we can take a case that if the discount rate varies, okay, then what would be happening for the decision makers regarding a particular policy or project. Okay, so these discount rates are really the deciding factor by the policy makers to take a policy decisions. Okay, so for example, if the discount rate is 0, right, even though we are considering for 1 year the policy that is meaningful for 1 year or 5 year or even 400 year, right, the value would be remaining same. Okay, so here we are considering what would be the value of $1 at different points in time, like from 1 year to 400 year in the future, using different discount rates. Okay, and that is the reason it is very essential to find out what are the discount rates. Okay, so perhaps you remember that the net present value, while calculating the net present value, right, so we have taken into account the future value, right, discounted future value, that means future value divided by 1 plus I to the power, let's say t, where I equal to this discount rate and t equal to your time factor. So when I would be varying, then this would be varying. Okay, and the policy decision is taken based on this parameter, that is NPV, if it is proved to be positive. Okay, so and that is the reason this I is really impacting a lot in taking a decision in terms of this NPV calculation or your benefit cost analysis. Okay, so if there is zero interest rate, irrespective of the number of years, we can find the value is remaining same, right? If the discount rate is 1%, then what is happening? The value is decreasing from the present value of present means 0th year, right? Today, from 100 to 99, right? And if you are going back for 100 year, the value is decreasing to 37. So the 100 is now getting down to 37. So likewise for 5% or 7%, right? If you are increasing the rate of discount, okay, that is rate of interest here, right, what is happening, that the value is really getting lesser and lesser, right? So if you are considering a particular project, right, let's say a particular project is continued for 100 years. Okay, and what you are finding, that for benefits and costs, the future benefits and costs, we have to discount that future benefit and cost to the present one through this formula, right? So that means this is very much useful in understanding this, and we are finding that the future benefits and costs of this discounted rates, right, is getting reduced. Okay, so for 7%, for the fifth year, it is just 71 and the present value is 100. Okay, so in this way, if we are thinking about the policies or value for a long term or across the generations, like 100 years or 400 years, so what we are doing is that this discount rate is very important, because what we are finding is that this discount rate is used for the calculation of NPV. Okay, and if the project under consideration or policies consideration is across generations or have long term repercussion like 100 years or 400 years, as you can find here, then what is happening is that for a higher discount rate, the value is really low, right? So that is the reason academicians, right, are now advocating that if the policy is about generations, about a long term activity where benefits and costs are to be taken into account, the discount rates should be minimum, right? So for example, while discussing about the climate change and climate repercussions, right? So in 2006 there is a strong publication, very popular and strong publication, and it is known as Stern's report on climate change, on economics of climate change. Okay, and there it is advocated to use just 0.1% as a discount rate in order to estimate the cost of the climate change or benefits of the climate change. Okay, because the climate change is having a longer repercussions. Okay, so so in that context, we need to understand what is the discounted rate that is used in the benefit cost analysis, and after that we need to understand what is the sensitivity analysis. Okay, so it is an extended form of your benefit cost analysis, and while doing a benefit cost analysis, it is very essential to do sensitivity analysis. Okay, so what is the sensitivity analysis? That we can find that many times the policy analysts conduct the benefit cost analysis using different discount rate. As I told you that if you are using 0%, right, what would be the repercussion? What would be the future? What would be the present benefit and cost of the future benefit and cost? And as a result, what would be the decision? If the discount rate is 7%, then what would be the decisions? Okay, so the sensitivity analysis here, we can do by using different discount rates to determine how robust the conclusions are across the discount rates. Okay, so what we are finding is that if a particular policy or program, right, for which we can get the social benefit to be more over the social cost for all reasonable discount rates that we discussed, right, then we can find that that policy would be preferable, or that program would be preferable, because the social benefits and social cost for all reasonable rates are preferable to a particular program or policy that has just positive net benefits for just one reasonable discount rate, isn't it? Okay, so this process of evaluating how analysis is getting affected by change in one of the key assumption or some of the key assumptions, that is called the sensitivity analysis. Okay, so for example, there is a proposal for using the solar panels, let's say. Okay, and this proposal for using solar panels should be considered for all government offices. Okay, what would be the benefits, likely benefits? The benefit would be that there would be lower future electricity bills, and that is to be borne by the government. Okay, and again, this amount of future electricity depends on future electricity or energy prices, right? So given this example, the benefit cost analysis may incorporate a sensitivity analysis using different estimates of future energy cost of or in terms of electricity cost, based on which the policymakers can make a decision that whether to install solar panels in all government offices or not. Okay, so likewise we can also take into account another important tool, that is cost effectiveness analysis. Okay, so what is this cost effectiveness analysis? Although we are using this benefit cost analysis, right, so and this benefit cost analysis is also perceived to be a very popular method in policy analysis, but it will not necessarily produce a very scientific answer for most socially beneficial course of actions. Okay, so then at that time we can consider about this cost effectiveness analysis, where the policies are ranked based on their cost, and this is known as the monetary aspects. So we are considering cost effectiveness. Okay, so when we are considering and ranking the policies or projects based on their cost, which is involving a monetary aspects for achieving some of the effectiveness or objectives, so that is considered to be non-monetary aspects. Okay, so but if you consider about benefit cost analysis, then this aspect cannot be taken into account. So that is the reason in those cases where non-monetary aspects are there and some monetary aspects are there, then cost effectiveness analysis should be the best measure for policy analysis. So for example, we can take this case. Let's say that the policymakers decided to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions, okay, by 5%, And what is the target? What is the objective? The objective is to combat the climate change. Okay. So, that is the reason this 5% target is put forth for reducing the carbon dioxide emissions. Okay. And for achieving this target of 5% reduction in CO2, right? So, there could be multiple alternatives to achieve the same target. Okay. So, and simultaneously, when the target is same and alternatives could be many, then they could also involve different costs. So, with differential cost and with different alternatives, the target could be the same. Okay. So, that is what is known as the monetary aspects, right, and non-monetary aspects. So, non-monetary aspect is the effectiveness, that is to reduce carbon dioxide emission by 5%. So, as a policy analyst, you can analyze and evaluate and rank various alternative options that are available which can reduce the CO2 emission by 5%. Okay. So, we can rank various policy options based on their cost, and by doing this exercise it can enable policymaker to decide on the most efficient option to achieve this target of achieving 5% reduction in emissions. Okay. And there are some requirements for this cost effectiveness analysis, because as you understand that this cost effectiveness analysis can be a better method in some situations. Okay, for making the decision about the efficient use of resources. So, the first case could be that when the policymakers have already decided to pursue some objectives regardless of what is the cost and the benefits compared to the competing projects. So, there the cost effectiveness analysis would be appropriate. And the second case could be when there is no reasonable consensus on how the relevant cost and benefits can be evaluated. Okay. So, in those cases the cost effectiveness analysis would be a better one. But however, although there are situations where the cost effectiveness analysis can be used, or there is an argument to use the cost effectiveness analysis, but however, this cost effectiveness analysis does not evaluate the worthiness of a particular project or policy based on its benefits in comparison to its cost, but it takes into account the outcome or goal as constant, just like in this example 5% effectiveness, that is 5% reduction in CO2, and evaluate the efficiency of different options for achieving this particular target. Okay. So, we can take an example in order to understand this cost effectiveness analysis. Okay. So, here we are considering that, let us take the case of an accident prone area, right, accident prone area, and the policy is targeting to minimize the accidents. Okay. And in order to address these accidents or reduce the accident, so there are three alternatives. Okay. So, I am just writing down that these are the three alternatives. Okay. Alternative 1, alternative 2 and alternative 3. Okay. So, the first alternative is in terms of concrete barrier, right. So, if you are making this concrete barrier on that accident prone area, then it is argued that the accident would be reduced. The second option is in form of wire mesh barrier. Okay. And the third one is in terms of a landscaped model. Okay. And the cost related to it is given, that let us say the initial cost in terms of dollar. Okay. So, for these two implemented, right, the initial cost is this much. Okay. And for this, the second option it is, and for third option it is. Okay. So, given this data, we can also find some other cost like annual maintenance cost. Okay. So, for the first cost, the first option, the annual maintenance cost is 30,000. Okay. 30,000, 40,000 and 20,000. And moreover, the annual uniform cost at 6 rate, right, it is also mentioned. So, annual uniform cost. So, for the first one, well, this is this much. Okay. For the second one, this is the figure is this one, 92, and for the third one it is 300. Okay. And as a result, the annual reduced number of accidents. So, annual reduced number of accidents for these three alternatives are also given: 85, 63 and 41. Okay. So now you have to take a decision, right, as a policy maker, that which one out of these three alternatives, which one should be taken into account for as accident barrier approach. Okay. So we have to find out the cost effective ratio for all these three cost effective ratio, okay, for all these three alternatives. Okay. So we are finding that this, for the first one we have calculated, and we found that the cost effective ratio for the first approach is 2127. Okay. So and the second one it is 1943, and the third one is 2521. Okay. So this is the cost effective ratio for the first is $2,127, $1,943 and $2,521. Okay. So this cost effectiveness ratio is found out by finding the cost divided by the effectiveness. Okay. So cost in the form of, since this is initial, this is annual, this is annual, this is annual, we can convert this present cost into annual cost. This is already annual cost, this is already annual cost, and this is effectiveness. So we convert all these into annual cost, okay, divided by the effectiveness, that is 85, and we are finding this result, right? So what is the interpretation? The interpretation is that for reducing one accident, okay, so we have to spend 2127 if we are following the first approach, first alternative, that is concrete barrier. Okay. And likewise, if you are implementing the second one, then the cost effective is 1943. That means for reducing one accident we have to spend this much, and likewise the third one. So now the decision maker will be in a position to take a decision that here the second one should be taken, because given the effectiveness, okay, the cost is the lowest. Okay. So what is the cost effectiveness ratio? That is 1943. And what is the interpretation? For reducing one, right, one accident, what is the cost that needs to be incurred annually? So that is 1943, which is the lowest one, and that is the reason we are taking into account this cost effect based on this cost effectiveness analysis. So we are considering this second policy approach or second alternative to be the best alternative. Okay. And the references that we can find here for this cost effectiveness analysis, you can follow chapter 8. For benefit cost analysis, you can follow chapter 11 of this book. Okay. As well as, okay, chapter 12 of this book. Okay. And you can also follow chapter 3 of this book as well as chapter 3 of this book. Okay. So thank you very much. And a case study of this benefit cost analysis will be taken by Professor Singh, right, in the next class. Thank you.